Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni miliwanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends and even your enemies about the podcast. And please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, Ghana, Himalaya, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Nic Yulo. She is here to celebrate Patch of Sky. Before we invite Nic into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by Candlewick Press, publisher of This is a School, written by John Shue and illustrated by Veronica Miller Jameson. In this moving celebration of schools and the people that make up the communities within, John Shue reminds us that a school is much more than a building. It's a place for work and play, creativity and trust, and a supportive community that extends beyond the school walls. I love this book, and I love that sentiment, letting our littlest kids know that a school is a place for them to thrive and to grow, a place where they have the right to feel safe and learn and make friends. This is a School is a beautiful book that is sure to be your new back-to-school favorite. This is a School is available now wherever you buy your books. Check it out. This is a School by John Shue. This episode of the podcast is also brought to you by The Adventures of Toby Baxter, The River Elf, The Giant, and The Closet, an exciting and thrilling middle grade novel written by Tim Wright. He's ready to leave kiddom behind, but can he stand tall against an army of barf-inducing beasts? Toby Baxter can't wait to be a teenager on the cusp of turning 13. The superhero-obsessed boy's jaw drops when a baffling stranger appears and begs him for help. But when he's led through a portal on a whirlwind trip to a magical land, Toby is terrified to be plunged mid-battle between elves and a legion of stinky trolls. Can this newly minted teen become a real warrior and rise up as the strange realm's savior? Find out by getting your copy of The Adventures of Toby Baxter, The River Elf, The Giant, and The Closet by Tim Wright. Join us right now from New York City in New York. I'm really excited. I have a feeling this is going to be a fantastic interview. Our guest is here today to celebrate her debut picture book. It's called Patch of Sky. Please welcome to the show, Nic Yulo. Nic, how are you?
Good. Hi, Jed. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really excited to have you on. This is your debut as an author illustrator. Tell us about Patch of Sky. I think it's a really kind of neat premise.
Oh, thank you. This is my debut author illustrator book, and it all started from the seed of an idea because I was reading an article about how pigs couldn't see the sky. So I found out pigs couldn't see the sky and was very indignant and shocked about it. And my mom and my brother were visiting at the time, so I remember running to them and being like, "Do you know this? This is appalling." And then I decided I needed to fix it. And the only way I knew how to fix it was to write a story. So that's how the book came to be.
That's really cool. That was one of the fun facts that was underneath one of my Snapple caps, I think.
Yeah, it's a lesser known thing, I would say. But yeah, it's shocking when you find out.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense, though, because they have those bodies, and there's not a lot of reason for a pig to stand upright.
They have a very horizontal spine.
Yeah.
So from what I gather, they can't angle their neck up. Like there's a limited range for how high they can look up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And when you think about it, if I were to find that out as a kid, if I were, and especially if I were living on a farm or had access to pigs and had a relationship and friendship with pigs, I'd be appalled too.
Yeah, I mean I was appalled, and I don't even live in a farm right now or are close to pigs. Because I had also, I think, simultaneously been reading an article about how intelligent pigs are.
Mm-hmm.
And there was one pig in particular that pulled their owner out of a burning building. So those articles together, I was very indignant, and I felt for the pigs.
Yeah, yeah.
So I needed to fix it.
I had a very close encounter with a pig that was kind of magical. There was a magic shop in the Baltimore area that was run by just a delightful magician, classic guy, Denny Lee. And I had heard about this shop for years, and as I was traveling around, I said, I'm going to get there, and I did. I went there, and I met Denny, and what a great guy, telling me stories for his decades and decades in magic. And I would hear this scraping on the ground, and I'm like, what is going on here? I don't know. But then he was just so fascinated, so I go back to his stories, but then the scraping would get louder, and what's going on? And then I felt something on my leg, and I looked down, and there was a 900-pound Vietnamese pot-bellied pig sniffing at my foot. And then he saw how surprised I was, and he knew I was going to be surprised, and he knew what the scratching was, and he was just waiting for her to go.
That's so funny. My dad, apparently, because one side of my family has a farm back home, and so my dad, when he was very young, also had a pig whose name was Eggman, which I think is hilarious and speaks volumes for my dad. Like that, it makes a lot of sense. So it's a very fond memory that he has.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You are quite the storyteller. I mean, this is your debut picture book, but you've been telling stories in a lot of mediums and learning how to tell stories in a lot of mediums for a long time. I'm guessing for all of your life.
Yes.
What is it about storytelling that so captures your passions?
God, there's so much to say. So I was lucky enough to grow up in a family that also was very into stories. So my great grandmother used to make up stories to put me to sleep at night. My mom works in the theater, so it was always something that I was around. And then when I got older, I became a voracious reader, which I think is the natural progression if you really like stories. And then the other natural progression apart from that is like, I need to start writing the stories that I wanted to see but wasn't finding. So it wasn't never a conscious decision on my part. It's just something that I always did. It was a comforting thing that I used to do. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until I was older that I realized, hey, you can actually do this for a living. So yeah, it took a while for that to click.
Isn't that wonderful when you figure out that I can get paid for doing something I really love?
Yeah, it's like people want to read my stuff. That's great.
Yeah. Such a wonderful thing. So you're an artist. You're an illustrator. You're a filmmaker.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit? Do you have to shift your mind to put a different kind of part of your brain in action when you're making a film as opposed to writing a picture book or just doing a standalone illustration?
It was actually a bigger transition. So I was writing a lot of prose fiction before I started doing film. So going from fiction to script writing is a huge sort of change of gears because for scripts, you have very little room to write any exposition. It's all dialogue. So that switch was really hard. But going from film to picture books made a lot of sense because I do a lot of sort of comic style panels in my picture books. So there are a lot of moments that don't have a lot of words, but you're seeing sort of the visual progression of the action, which is exactly what a film is, only you have more moving parts in a film as opposed to a picture book.
Mm-hmm. Do you, as a creator, do you appreciate the fact that as an illustrator, as you're illustrating a picture book, you can kind of make anything happen on that page? You don't have to worry about a budget or, actors union telling you can't do that with that actor. You can just kind of do whatever you want and create on the page.
Yeah, that is honestly one of the best things ever. And I also write a little bit for video games. So the transition of going from indie film where everything is dictated by budget. And then suddenly I was in a situation where like, oh, we can explode this helicopter and that's not going to affect me. That's amazing. So that sort of possibility is really great, especially when you write fiction, because then you really don't have to worry even about drawing or the budget. You're just like, okay, we're going to be in this fantastical castle. There will be a dragon and a helicopter, and we're good.
I want to get back to writing for video games in a minute, but I want to get into a little bit of Patch of Sky. What kind of thing after our main character? I think the main character's name is Pia.
Yes.
So after Pia discovers that, oh my goodness, my pig can't see the sky. What does she do to try to solve that problem?
Yes. So the line that sort of echoes throughout the story is Pia's on a mission. So she basically, what does she not try is the better question. Like she tries everything that she can think of. And she's a very sort of determined, creative thinker. And I don't want to spoil the ending, but she gets to a point where she's tried everything that she can think of. And there seems to be no way for her to share the sky with Patches. And then she has a sort of epiphany at the end and then changes her perspective around a bit. And that's how she finally gets him to see the sky. Yeah.
So we solve the problem by changing our perspective.
Yes.
What a great lesson to teach our kids.
Yeah. So part of the reason I wanted to write the story is I grew up as a little girl who was very stuck on getting good grades. I was a huge perfectionist and I put a lot of pressure on myself. It wasn't really coming from my family or anything. I just felt like I needed to be perfect. And so part of this story was I wanted to show kids that you don't have, like, the plan will go awry. You don't have to be perfect. But if you sort of change your perspective and expand your way of thinking, you will still be able to change someone's world.
Yeah. That's something I've shared here on the podcast, that I had a transition. I was in social work and then I transitioned into performing magic shows at schools. But in the middle of that, I had a opportunity to work with kids with severe developmental disabilities. And I had no business working with them. They just, they needed somebody who was loud, who was willing to get out and advocate for kids and enjoyed playing with kids and helping them play. And they had a program where they were trying to get their kids into the community. So I guess I was a perfect choice for that. But like I said, I had no idea. I never went to school to learn what these kids couldn't do. So I would go and I would try unheard of things with the kids, and the therapist and the doctors and the nurses and the teachers would all scream and go, "No, that kid can't do that." But I'm like, but he's doing it. Don't you see? He's doing it. And so I think that that's really valuable to remind our kids to just look at things in different perspectives. You know, specialization and expertise is great, but sometimes it can really limit your vision.
Yes, I completely agree. I think particularly kids who fall into the perfectionist trap feel like they need to do things a certain way. And if they don't get it right on the first try, then they've failed. Mm-hmm. And there's no moving forward from that. So this story was trying to say, like, no, there is another way. Just don't give up, kind of thing. Yeah.
Thank goodness. Our life isn't
Surprise.
over after. Thank goodness life isn't over after we fail, because I would have been a long time.
Yeah.
So you were talking to us about writing for video games. I'll be honest with you. The first time I heard anybody say I write for video games or that somebody writes for video games, I'm like, what are you talking about? Video games, it's just blowing stuff up. I grew up with Pong, so that was, that's where my interest in video games began and ended. But there really are very complex stories with a lot of video games.
Yes, especially recently, there's been an explosion of stuff you can do. And it's gotten to the point where video games have reached and even surpassed what movies can do. In a lot of instances. And of course, the refreshing thing about a game is you don't have to watch the main character. You get to be the main character. Mm. So that's an exciting thing that I always look forward to, because it's when you're writing a film, you're sort of telling a story from beginning, middle to end, and it's a very finite thing. But when you're writing for someone to play your main character, there's something that is more dynamic in that process that's hard to explain.
Yeah, because I'm trying to wrap my head around that. How do you write? Well, how do you write a story that somebody else is going to finish?
Well, I mean, that's a very long discussion. It's actually, it has a lot in common with writing for film and TV. Because at the end of the day, you're still trying to write a really good story. These stories just end up being a lot bigger. And it depends on what kind of game you're playing, because there are open world games, there's sort of more closed narrative games. But you're usually working with a team of writers like in TV, and you're usually having to accommodate several eventualities depending on what the character decides to do. So you're writing a slightly larger story and trying to do a very rich world for this character to sort of play around in.
That's really fascinating. But, one of the things, and I've shared on the podcast that I made many mistakes as a parent. Thankfully, none of them fatal, because both of my adult kids are amazing, and they're very successful despite the fact that I was their dad. But I know one of the things, my daughter and I had a lot in common, and it was easy for us to do a lot of things together and talk about a lot of things. My son was more into the video games and the manga, and I wasn't at that time in my life. I wasn't into the blow up everything and hack off everybody's head. And it was really hard for me to kind of put myself in that space and to play the games. But I did try on a bunch of time, and I did play with them but I didn't appreciate the fact that there was story there, and that there was value, and that I could have helped his experience become richer had I invested the time and the effort to play a little bit more with him and then talk to him about the games the same way we talk and read with our kids.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And growing up, I remember I was always very into games, and so was my brother. The difference between us was that I was also a huge reader and he wasn't. So I never assumed that he was into story as much as I was. But I remember a day coming into his room and we were talking, and he had somehow learned the entire sort of Greek mythological, or Genesis story. And I'm like, how do you know this? Because I like reading about mythology, and he had played a game that was about Greek mythology, and he had learned it passively playing the game. And this was accurate information. So I feel like, yes, people tend to sort of underestimate the capacity of games to really tell stories and teach kids. It isn't just blowing people up. Sometimes it's blowing people up, but a lot of the time there's a lot of sort of potential to tell a story through a game.
Yeah. And that's one of the things that the Reading with Your Kids podcast, I started the podcast 5 years ago because I wanted families to experience what I experienced. That, the conversations we need to have with our kids when they're 14, 15, 16 years old, they start when they're 2 and 3 years old, reading books and developing that bond and that closeness and having those conversations about a pig who can't see the sky. Because there's so many places you can go with that. You can ask, what do you think? Well, how would you, if you were Pia, what would you do? Those are great, empowering conversations. And I think if we get into the habit of doing that, we should remember to continue to read with our kids as they get older, read the manga, read the anime, play the video games, watch the movies together, and listen to music together, and continue that conversation. Because media is such a big part of our kids' lives, such a big part of our lives. And it offers so many opportunities to grow closer and share values and share opinions and what do we think what is happening in the world.
I agree. And I think both reading and games, unfortunately, it's a very insular experience. So if you're not actively trying to do that, I feel like it's very easy for a kid to go into their little world and be in that world. So I would have appreciated if people reached out to me when I was reading these stories and playing these games and just discuss what I was seeing. I remember wanting, reading a book and wanting to tell people about it and connecting in that way, but there wasn't there weren't people that were interested enough in what I was doing. So that would have been really nice.
Yeah. And I suppose, too, if there are families out there thinking, oh, this is really violent and I'm not real comfortable with that, instead of letting the kid play the big violent game themselves, maybe you play the game with them and talk about it, and then if you see any warning signs, that's the best place to catch it.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. There are so many other games that are not violent at all. I tend to like games that, while they might be violent, sometimes it's never gratuitous violence, so that it's always a good starting point to have discussions, I think, with your kids. And kids in general, in my experience, kind of have a good sense of what their threshold is too. Discussions would help, and it's not so much imposing a limit on them, because one of the best things my dad ever did was he never tried to limit what I was reading. And I sort of could tell what I should be reading, what I shouldn't be reading. I was never reading things that I shouldn't be, I think, for the most part. But yeah, there's a lot of room for discussion, and more than discussion, it's a good sort of starting off place to build that relationship with your kid.
So we've talked about all the different ways you're telling story: picture books, prose, video games, filmmaking. Is there a method of storytelling that you haven't explored yet that you really want to get into? Is there a medium that we're not aware of that you kind of know that you can kind of give us a sneak peek into?
Is there a medium that I'm not aware of is the question too. 'Cause the thing with media in general is things are changing so rapidly, like even in video games, like the way you can tell these stories are changing by the day, 'cause it's so quickly evolving. I would love to work in television. So television and video games are closer to me in writing style than film is. 'Cause film, you basically have an hour, 2 hours, your script lasts that long, and your story ends, unless you're doing a Marvel film and then you have 10,000 sequels. You mostly end. But with games, you have the capacity to have like downloadable content, so you're dropping seasons in the same way that television drops seasons. And you have more room to sort of explore the character relationship. So I would love to get into TV. Let's see what happens in the next few years.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. I used to be a huge movie lover, and it was, going to all the openings. I'm at the point in my life right now where I can binge a season of a show on Netflix, but I cannot sit through a 2-hour movie in the theater. I don't get it.
I mean, that's the thing too. I think with binging, like in video games, you weren't in a theater watching a giant screen from far away. Like you're watching from your laptop, your TV at home. It became a very intimate experience. So both games and television shows like are in your home. You're there right in front, and you have the ability to binge 13 episodes of a show. You don't have to wait. We're not in the days that you had to wait a week for a new episode to drop, for the most part, unless it's a new show.
Right.
So I like that sort of the potential of that relationship. It's a more intimate relationship with a viewer.
Yeah. I hear you about the series. I always get very angry when I start a new series and I get to episode 4 and it's like, 5 comes out next week. And I'm like, what? They're not all released. Why did I start this now?
Yeah.
Hey, Nic, this is my podcast, and I love that it's my podcast, and I can make up whatever rules I want. I mentioned to you that I have friends in the Philippines before we started recording, and one of those friends is a young illustrator who is in her 3rd year of design school. What advice would you give to her as she is starting her career?
I would say try not to put so much pressure on yourself. Again, we're back to being the perfectionist kind of thing, especially when you're starting a career in any kind of creative field. It's not a very straight line. I mean, it hasn't ever been a straight line. And I feel like if you feel like you're supposed to be hitting certain milestones at a certain time, like you're just going to run yourself into the ground and burn yourself out. So I would just say, keep practicing your skills. Try to absorb everything you can. I like going to museums and looking at art that I can never hope to accomplish. Discipline also helps, just being able to draw. I'm not the kind of person that says you have to draw or write every day. But keeping sort of a steady practice helps, and not feeling like you need to reach a certain level of success right out the bat, I think.
Yeah. And that's great advice for anybody in any field, I think.
Yeah. Makes sense. I mean, life, we're so used, especially coming out of school, we're so used to there being a bar that needs to be set and reached, and then that you're successful. That's the only way to be successful. And then you get out of school and you're like, there are no rules. No one knows what they're doing. We're all just trying to do our best.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, I would not be at my best if I didn't ask you to tell us where we can go to find out more about Patch of Sky and more about you.
Yeah, so my website is nicyulo.com. So that's NICYULO.com. Patch of Sky is available everywhere. It's weird to say, but it's available everywhere. You can find it online, especially on the Penguin site. And my social media is all under my same name, so NICYULO.
We've had a really fun time speaking to the author-illustrator of Patch of Sky. Our guest has been Nic Yulo. Nic, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Our guest will be Sarah Eminem Ward. She'll be here to celebrate our Nic U journey. That's the next episode of the podcast. Hey, please be sure to connect with us on social media. Facebook.com/readingwithyourkids. At Reading With Your Kids on Instagram. At Reading With Your Kids on TikTok. And at Jedley Magic on Twitter. We love to hear from our listeners on social media. We also love to get messages. You can send us a message by going to our website, readingwithyourkids.com, clicking on the contact button at the top of the page. And let us know what you love about the show. Let us know what we could be doing better. And let us know who you would like to hear on a future episode of the podcast. We want to thank the folks who made this episode of the podcast so wonderful. Of course, we want to start by thanking the author and illustrator of Patch of Sky, our guest, Nic Yulo. Please be sure to check out her wonderful book. Also want to thank our sponsors. Tim Wright. Be sure to check out his middle grade novel, The Adventures of Toby Baxter, The River Elf, The Giant, and The Closet. I love that they're barf-inducing trolls. It's just great. We also want to thank the folks at Candlewick Press, publishers of This is a School by John Shue. Beautiful, beautiful book. We love it. The folks who saw the book at our event at the Buttonwood Park Zoo just fell in love with it. Also want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Nicole Belcastro, Mirabella Q, Rain Penn. Want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.